before we dive into some really important questions that will deeply serve our listeners, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge something. About 2 or 3 years ago, I came across Jillian when she had around 100,000 followers. Fast forward to today, she's approaching nearly 3 million. What stands out to me is not the numbers themselves, but the explosive organic growth clearly built on the hard work and the genuine service behind it. It's evident that behind the scenes, you're deeply committed and putting in the work. And I've got a lot of respect for that. And I also hold a deep respect for the clarity, consistency, and the power of your message. Welcome to the podcast.
Wow. Well, thank you so much. That's a beautiful introduction. I really appreciate that. Thank you.
You're very, very welcome. And now to dive in and serve our listeners as powerfully as possible. Something that you mentioned that I read is working on a relationship means working on ourselves. And we share very similar views here. Could you elaborate on how personal growth and relationship work are deeply interconnected?
Yes. So there's nothing, all relationships do this, but to me, and I'm sure you agree, there's nothing quite like a romantic relationship that is going to put a mirror in front of us and ask of us that we confront certain aspects of ourselves, certain conditioning, beliefs, and behavior that needs to be addressed. And so oftentimes when we have to work on a relationship, like what does it mean to, work on a relationship? It means to work on the things, to address the things that are getting in the way of intimacy, emotional intimacy. And a lot of times what's getting in the way, what's happening when there is a disconnect between two people who are in a relationship, it starts with something that's going on inside ourselves. It's fear of not being enough, or maybe it's communication skills or lack thereof. It's our ego, wanting to be good enough or fearing that we're not going to be good enough. And so we do that thing that we always do when we feel like we're not good enough. For some people that's pulling away. For other people, that's getting angry. For other people, that's, disengaging from the relationship and putting more of their energy into things outside of the relationship. That doesn't need to be another person. It could be work. And so a relationship is only as strong and robust and healthy and close as both people are healthy, strong, and robust. It's really about, we don't have to be perfectly healthy, whole people to make a relationship great. But we do have to be 100% committed and understanding what's actually getting in the way of us being totally committed and what are some of the barriers, psychological, emotional barriers that we have to closeness.
And I believe you mentioned that you said we don't heal in isolation.
Yeah, we don't.
And I think that's so powerful because it's like we can tell ourselves, oh, we're feeling free. We're feeling good. We're healing. We can even tell ourselves the story, I'm healing. I'm feeling great. But it's all happening in isolation. And then the moment we enter a relationship, we become aware of all that we've been avoiding.
There's nothing like a romantic relationship that is going to remind you of how fucked up you are.
Yes. And it's that grace as well, right? Having grace for ourselves. Because it's like, and you talk about that as well, that there is no such thing as being perfectly healed. So would you say there are certain things that can only be healed in relationship?
Vulnerability is such an important part of a relationship. It's the allowing of you to be fully seen by the person who you're in a relationship with. And so many of us fear it. It used to be, men feared it most because vulnerability is weakness for men. But now we're seeing just as many women, or almost as many women, who are afraid of it as well. I think for women, or for the feminine, it's more like, I've been hurt, I feel unsafe, so I'm only going to be vulnerable if you make me feel safe. As opposed to, part of what's going to create safety in the relationship is you taking the risk to be vulnerable even before you feel 100% safe. And so the healing that is possible in a romantic relationship that I don't believe is nearly as possible if we're single is allowing ourselves to be fully seen by someone. We all enter a relationship with some sort of unconscious fear of not being good enough. And, I really think that two people are right for each other. One of the things that make them really right for each other is that they really believe in one another, and they both are affirmed at how enough they are as human beings by being with each other. That doesn't mean that you don't challenge your partner when there is a bad habit that they have or behavior that needs to change. But at the core, you are affirming to each other that you are both enough and have value as you are. And that's hard to get elsewhere.
It's almost like a decision, because if there is no perfect moment, as you just mentioned really powerfully, then it's a decision we get to make inside ourselves. Hey, I choose to be, or I choose to affirm that I'm good enough or far enough in my healing to allow myself to be fully seen.
I agree with you. I do very much think it's a choice. I think so many things are really boiled down to choice. Like, I'm going to choose to believe this right now. Or I'm going to choose to your point, trust that I've done enough work on myself and the rest is just going to be revealed in the relationship, and I'm open to it. I'm open to learning.
Let's talk about the one. I know you talk about this, and perhaps we have slightly different opinions about this, but based on your perspective, number one, does the one exist? Because of course there are so many cultural myths fueled by romanticized ideals. There's so much misleading content about twin flames, trauma bonds. It's all mixed up. It's all a wild mess. Get your ex back strategies. When someone runs away, then you chase them and all of that. What is your perspective of the one?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's exactly what you're saying. The one has so much meaning attached to it. And the meaning that's attached to it is really what I challenge most, which is that there's only this one person who's going to come into your life. And when you meet them, everything in your life is going to fall into place and you're going to have a perfect relationship. Whereas I believe there's the one who was the one for you at 17. There's the one who some people married and it was amazing for 3 years and then it wasn't. You're still going to have to confront yourself. You're still going to have to face your demons. You're still going to have to put in the work. And the cultural significance and meaning that is held within this concept of the one implies strongly that this person, when they come into your life, is not going to challenge you. They're just going to emancipate you, from whatever like your stuff is. And because of that, they are actually going to make you happy. They are going to fulfill you because when you meet the one, you are then fulfilled. Whereas that's not true. There is no one who can fulfill you solely. There are people who can add to your fulfillment. There are people who can make your life so much better. But whatever disconnect a person might feel from their purpose, whatever disconnect they might feel from their bodies, whatever disconnect they might feel from their mom or their father, their brother or their sister, their community, that person in your life who you love, who you called the one, can't fix that for you. And by them being in your life, they're not going to fix it. But they can support you as you pursue these things. They can make the road a little bit easier. But happiness is an inside job.
So what I'm hearing here is you're challenging these kind of expectations and wrong associations around the one, where people think, oh, this person is going to fulfill me, this person is going to fix me, this person is going to save me, and then it doesn't happen. And this kind of holding on to this false hope is almost putting that healing and that inside job that you mentioned outside of ourselves. We're giving someone else the responsibility, which of course, as you described and is a recipe for suffering.
It's a recipe for suffering. And also you use the word expectations. It's expectations that destroys relationships. It really does. I mean, of course we're going to have some expectation, but the bigger our expectations, the lower our appreciation. Then we're just like placing all this expectation, and guess what? Then you realize that the one is flawed and is on a similar level of consciousness as you. You know, there's no like angel with this angelic like or God-like level of consciousness that's coming into your life that's going to like, you know, lead you to your level of consciousness.
Also the danger here around trauma bonding and people being drawn to kind of unsafe intimacy or a very unsafe attraction. You talk about that level of unsafe chemistry, not settling for that, not chasing that. Specifically when there is so much confusion around that, then of course these kind of ideas and cultural myths, they kind of aggravate that trauma even more. So it's so important to challenge that. Now, leading into that, people who have experienced unsafe emotional intimacy or physical intimacy, what advice would you give them on their path of, number one, attracting a partner that is secure and safe, and also recognizing that, because that's not always that easy?
So it's first just getting real with yourself about some of your patterns and, you know, what these relationships kind of brought into your life. Did they bring a lot of chaos into your life? You know, we have to be able to say, how have I been complicit in my own suffering? Where have I played a role in creating circumstances in my life, such as these relationships, that I say I do not want? And I wonder why I've been in these relationships. And it can be very, very confusing. This is the question that is asked of me most often. Why, if I, you know, have my life together, am I in this relationship? You know, or why can't I seem to let this person go even though I know they're not right for me? And it's layered, right? It's layered. It could be because you're lonely. It could be because you're bored. It could be because the game that you play with this person is a game you need to grow out of and grow up out of. Maybe you're tolerating less than you deserve, for example, in a relationship because you don't know where the line is supposed to be drawn as far as your tolerance because it wasn't modeled to you by your mom or your dad. So you just saw them tolerating a lot. And so the line of where to draw between what is tolerable versus intolerable is very, very, very blurry. And so we have to start to kind of ask ourselves these questions. We have to start to do that necessary self-examination and to understand, you know, a lot of women will find themselves very attracted to the quote unquote bad boy, right? That archetype. Well, why? You know, we're drawn to the bad boy because how they are depicted in film and whatnot, they're going to protect you. They're strong. They're very masculine. And that's for the feminine, that's a huge turn on. But in reality, in the real world, not in the movies, in the real world, the bad boy is actually very weak and narcissistic and isn't going to serve you like a strong man is. He just wants to take from you. So a lot of women who typically go for that need to understand, sort of redefine and re-understand and relearn and rewire and all of that, what it really means for a man to be masculine. And that you can meet that, you know, bad guy, whatever, and still be like, oh, he's hot. But still have the discipline and the wisdom. Because at first it's going to take discipline. And then as you mature and you've been around the block a few times and you know what being in that kind of relationship does to you, and your priorities change as you get older, then it's not going to require so much discipline. But in the beginning, it might be like, yeah, but I'm not going there. I don't want that. I can acknowledge that I'm attracted to this person. I think they're hot. And I can still make the decision to not pursue anything with them. I mean, we're going to be attracted to loads of people. Just because you love someone doesn't mean you're not going to be attracted to someone else. But you have the wisdom and the self-control to be like, yeah, that's an attractive person. And maybe in a completely different world where I wasn't in a relationship and in love, maybe I pursue that. But no, I'm not going there. Like, we're always going to have to make those kind of choices in life. So it's about understanding. It's a lot of learning, rewiring, understanding your family of origin, and then making the choice to say, you know what, I'm not going to do that anymore. And when it comes to like unhealthy chemistry, we can't play the role of the victim. We have to say, I'm co-creating this sort of like addictive trauma bond between me and this person. It's not just them, it's me. So let me focus on healing me.
The example you gave around the bad boy is almost like the bad boy is the fantasy. But a man who is safe, who is present, a man who is truly committed and consistent, he is what the heart truly desires. So almost taking this to a spiritual level, we can almost distinguish. One is the fantasy, that's kind of the biological attraction, and in spiritual terms, perhaps kind of on a mind level. And the other is a deeper desire that is within us. And dropping into that and being able to at the beginning discipline but specifically discern between the two.
Yes, to differentiate and to discern between the two. Very, very wise point. And look, fantasies are free. They're fun. But to be able to say that's a fantasy, that's actually not something that's rooted in reality or even something that I want. And so that's why we have to understand that when we're watching some movies that we understand that this is sort of like the fantasy and to have a little bit of fun with it perhaps, but to realize that that translated in real life doesn't work.
And it's almost like the identification with that as well, because when our level of consciousness is, and there's no judgment there, but when we're at a level of consciousness where we've got a fantasy and we follow that immediately, that speaks to the lack of discipline you were referring to, because essentially we have no discipline with ourselves. We're just following blindly whatever comes up, which also does not make us safe partners.
And you know you're growing. And it's interesting because this is just a fun fact. I like all kinds of film and I like all kinds of literature. And even though I teach a lot about sort of waking people up from this sort of hypnosis that romanticism has sort of put us in. I'm kind of a romantic at heart and I like kind of like silly girly stuff on TV and stuff like that. Like I like dark stuff and I like the silly girly stuff. And when it's as I've kind of like matured in my own understanding of this, it's interesting to see which male characters on screen I'm attracted to now versus what I was attracted to when I was younger. And that's really interesting. And it's always going to be the man who's just like committed, like deeply committed and present. Whereas before it's like, is he going to beat someone up for me? Like that kind of thing. I also think that something that's going on a lot in the zeitgeist right now, which I think is related to our work and related to our conversation today, is this idea of, what it means to sort of be high value.
Oh, I don't even like the word as much, to be honest.
No, it drives me crazy.
I don't like it. Same.
It drives me crazy. And this idea of like, I'm looking for a high value man or I'm looking for a high value woman. And I hate the word high value, but if we're just going to use it for just an example here, what about you becoming that person versus just looking for that person? And so bringing this full circle to your original question, like how a relationship is really about our relationship with ourselves and personal development, we have to be equally focused on who we have to become than we are on the kind of partner that we want to attract. Like, are you someone who people that you want to be with? What needs to change in you? What needs to open in you?
And that's so much more powerful than writing a list of what someone desires. This is kind of taking the work at a much deeper level and looking at the places that need to shift and change within ourselves to enable that reality. Something I've heard you talk about as well, about this kind of cultural obsession with why. Why did they cheat? Why did they ghost me? How could they do this to me? I'm sure you see this all the time. I see it all the time. Why? Give me an answer. And yet, rarely does the answer, even if there is the perfect answer, rarely does it truly bring peace. What would you say to someone who is stuck in this obsessive cycle of why? If I only understand, then I will feel at peace.
When it's cheating and it's a marriage, you want to understand the why, because if you are trying to work on your marriage and stay together, you have to understand the why. But let's just say it's someone who's, giving you breadcrumbs of attention, or they broke up with you, or you've been like only with them for 6 months. Like my husband I was married many, many years ago. It's part of like what's in my book. And the way that he ended things with me was horrible. It was like over a text, just absolutely horrible. And I became obsessed with that, wanting to understand why. And what I had to do was shift the focus on myself. And trying to understand the messiness of another person's mind, of another person's head is impossible. It's like, why did they ghost you? Why did they do that? Well, because they don't feel good enough, because they're weak, because they're scared, because, they have bad character, because they're battling a demon inside themselves that's so big that has it's bigger than you. It's like not even about you. It's all these things. But if you can turn the analyzation towards yourself and just say, okay, why did I stay in this? Why did I tolerate this? Why am I so sad about this ending with someone who I only knew for a couple of weeks? What am I learning from this? So yeah, it's really very difficult, and it's very hard to talk someone out of the obsessing stage of it. But you're never gonna figure out your ex anyway. And to your point, once you do, the pain's actually not gonna go away.
To your other point, that we will never understand the messiness of someone else's mind. I love that. And it also reminds me specifically when people find themselves stuck with a narcissist, ultimately, because especially there, this becomes aggravated and amplified to a degree. And it's almost like, hey, let's slow down. You cannot understand this person because, number one, you don't think like them. You don't act like them. You treat others differently. What makes you think that you could ever understand where they're coming from?
Yeah, it's like trying to understand, 100% your dog who can't speak. It's like, you're trying to go into the mind of your canine. It's like it's a different species, definitely, for sure. But you said something really reminded me of something interesting, which is when we're in a relationship with someone, let's like shelving narcissism. Let's say you're in the right relationship. You're in a relationship with someone who is different. Like they grew up differently from you. They might be a different gender than you. They have their own sort of blueprint and perspective of the world. And I do think that part of what makes a relationship strong is when two people are intently invested in understanding the other person. And that said, we're never going to fully understand another person anyway, because we can barely understand ourselves.
And it's an incredible empathy and compassion in there. It's almost like the highest level of empathy. Hey, I can't relate to your pain right now or to what's coming up for you. But instead of shutting down, instead of withdrawing, instead of trying to make the other person feel wrong or even dismissing what they're experiencing, but I love you so much that I will give my very best to understand where you're coming from. And it's almost like what you're describing, understanding. I can almost visualize it right now as you're speaking, as this bridge. Like there is one person with their experience and their pain, there is the other person with their experience, and understanding creates almost the bridge and the connection from heart to heart, and the love can flow even though both have a different experience.
And I think it's also important, like something you said that really reminds me of your work, which is that, because, you brought up trauma bonds and, childhood and stuff like that. There's so many different roads to healing. And I think that sometimes it doesn't mean you have to go to therapy for years to heal your attachment style. Sometimes it's like so many men, as I'm sure you know, struggle with avoidance in their romantic relationships. Maybe not in life in general. They could be like very, very, very committed, non-avoidant people in the world. But in their romantic relationships, men tend to hide their feelings and their shame and go into avoidance. And that man who struggles with it doesn't necessarily need to be in therapy. And I say that necessarily. He could just learn the principles of presence and stepping into his own power and learning how to be vulnerable. And that could heal it.
This is why I'm so passionate about men's work specifically, because sometimes I would have a man with, in some cases, 1,000 hours or more of therapy. He would come to me, and in a very short amount of time, we create a breakthrough that just hasn't happened. And that's not because I'm a magician, but it's simply because this person needed a different tool. And I always like to say, for the person who wants to understand conceptually their childhood trauma, who wants to begin this journey of understanding where their wounding might come from, therapy is amazing. absolutely amazing. But when we're looking for these embodied shifts, might not always be the right resource.
It's the change. Yeah. And it also, sometimes you have to have a conversation with mom or dad. That's really difficult to have, I've worked with a lot of men who didn't feel good enough for their father, And once they had a conversation with their father, like it was like something, it was like in a conversation, it was usually me there mediating, or like overseeing it, but so many things can shift. But yes, you're totally right.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that when people or couples come to you and there is such an elephant in the room, which usually always is, right? There is that elephant in the room. Let's talk about your mother. Oh, well, I don't want to.
Yeah,
but
I know.
Can you share a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, I think that it's very important that two people who are in a romantic relationship, a marriage, something comparable, that they know how the pain of their childhood kind of manifests in their adulthood. I think they need to know what each other struggles with and, what life was like for them as a child. Because people can get really nasty, they can say, well, you're just like this and blah, 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 and do all this blaming. It's like, no. Can you understand that because her mother left when she was 2 years old, that there is an abandonment wound there that you need to know about and have some sensitivity around. And she has to also recognize that just because that happened, that doesn't mean everyone's going to abandon her. Or maybe that happening, which is terrible, gave her strength and resilience that she never would have had if her mom was there. So this idea of, because we're responsible for ourselves in a relationship, being the only thing. No, we're responsible actually for each other. That's what a relationship is. And we're responsible. We have to have accountability. But if you can have accountability and your partner can be like, you know what? Like my girl, like her mother left the family when she was 2 years old, and that left a huge scar. So I'm not going to do that thing that I did in all my past relationships where, when I'm angry, I go take space and then kind of leave it up to her to kind of figure out when I'm going to come back. I'm not going to do that anymore. Number one, that's just not nice. Number two, that's not who I want to be in a relationship. Number three, I love this person and I don't want to do that to someone I love. And that's why I am so invested in learning and teaching about what it is to love someone and to shift just a little bit of the focus around poor me and my trauma and my avoidant and my attachment style. And how can I actually learn to love more and rise above my own past and have more empathy in a relationship, because empathy is probably the most important thing in any relationship ever.
What you just said reminds me of the first question, also the kind of how the personal work is so interconnected in a relationship. It's almost like it becomes at the beginning, I don't want to do this to the person I love, but then it becomes also it's not just being done for the other person.
Yeah, you're like, I don't want to be that person anymore.
And that's powerful, that distinction. Like, I'm not doing this for you, even though, of course, because I love you, but just what you said there, yes. I no longer want to be that person.
And we all have to decide, and we can make that choice every day. What kind of partner who do I want to be today? How do I want to act? What kind of partner do I want to be?
Maybe the most powerful question there is, who do I need to be? Or who am I going to be? You mentioned about avoidance and just briefly touching upon attachment dynamics. One thing I wanted to ask you here is something that I hear, one of the most common, the avoidant anxious attachment dynamic. You've seen it so many times. It's so common in this world. And yet so often the language I hear around it can almost induce a slight shame. And I don't believe that's the intent of the ones I'm talking about right now. But it's almost like when you come across it, it's like, well, you love them, but they're anxious and you're avoidant. you're basically fucked. That's it. Just find a secure partner, and you know what? You can try this stuff, but what is your opinion?
This is an interesting nuance. I do think that people who are highly anxious in their relationships or highly avoidant destroy their relationships. They sabotage their relationships. People who are avoidant, both of them are kind of lacking empathy and just thinking about themselves. I'm uncomfortable, so I'm going to run. Or I'm uncomfortable, so I'm going to make this person sit down with me and talk to me now. I do think, though, that, we're never a finished product. And I think that if you have some anxiety, or let's just say you are someone who really values, it's about aligning values. So if you're someone who really values togetherness and closeness, and let's say your thought is, your opinion is, your mentality is, when there's conflict, I want to sit down and talk about it and fix it right now, which I think is actually the best mentality to have. And then you're in a relationship with someone who's kind of always pulling away whenever there's conflict. That's going to be a nightmare. And I would say your values are misaligned, because your value says, I want to talk about it right now. And you can even say, if we don't, like, that also makes me very anxious, but that's okay that makes you anxious in my book, because I think it should make you anxious. I think couples need to talk about the problem. So let's just say you're someone who loves your independence, but you want to be in a relationship too, and you're committed. But once a month, you like to have a weekend alone and go on a solo trip. If you're going to be with someone who's really, really anxious and is always going to associate you going on your weekend trip alone once a month, even though the rest of you is totally committed, then maybe that's not a good match for you. Maybe you need someone who has a similar degree of independence in their life. So I do think there is some nuance there, but what I really strongly agree with is this idea of like, oh, I have anxious attachment, or I have avoidant attachment, or they're this, they're that. First of all, what does that even mean? Do you know even what that means? Because the person who is constantly pulling away, constantly shutting down, constantly breadcrumbing you, or the person who can't give you a moment to yourself, is completely codependent, blah, blah, blah. This goes beyond your attachment style. Like, there's a pathology there that's going way beyond that comes with trauma, that comes with extreme selfishness, which comes with maybe an extreme level of immaturity. There's a lot of context that's missing from the conversation.
It's also, okay, all these things are so helpful, but not when they become our identity. I am anxious attached, I am this, and it's almost like building a cage around ourselves. Whereas, okay, you've got a coping mechanism or a tendency to become anxious in certain situations in the relationship. Okay, great. And now we can work on that. But if it becomes this kind of personal story, and I also like what you shared about kind of the context of the example you gave, that's not a label for everything. There is more nuance to it.
Yes, always.
Because a person could be anxious and another person avoidant, but if they have the same values, which is we want to connect, there might be tension. It won't be easy.
But you can work through it if you're mature and you're self-aware and you notice this is my tendency and you both have this, who do I want to be in the relationship? Absolutely. That's very different than two people totally unconsciously entrenched in their own stuff, not realizing what's happening. Then you throw into the mix a lot of immaturity. And maybe you throw into the mix mixed values, and maybe you throw into the mix just like two people who are just, or one person just like not even that good of a person, then it becomes very complex.
Let's say a person is avoidant, and use the example of, you said they're very selfish, they're always pulling away. And then the anxious could be like putting that label on them, or they're just being avoidant, which could also become almost an excuse or a justification for actually misaligned values, as you were sharing.
Yes, exactly. Or they're just avoidant. Maybe they don't actually like you that much, or they're not as attracted to you. Because there's a lot in like if we're going to take this into dating, why are they so avoidant? No. They are not actually that emotionally connected to you. And if you were really honest with yourself, you don't feel that emotionally connected to them, but your ego is so involved and you want them to choose you so that you're obsessing over them.
To wrap this up, I heard you talk about stress and how stress relates to intimacy. And talking now specifically about intimacy in the bedroom. How does stress affect intimacy in the bedroom? Or we can also say intimacy in general, if you wish to answer it in general.
Yeah, well, let's touch on all of it. So stress is rarely what happens to us. It's how we are reacting to what's happening. And most of the time people are highly stressed out and there's actually nothing major happening. There's no death, there's no like family, because there are certain things that happen in life that are incredibly stressful. But even if something big is happening, these are the things that can drive couples apart, because we get very consumed, we get in our heads, we are carrying so much tension, and we are sort of divorced from our bodies, and all the sort of energy of our body is going right into our heads, overthinking, ruminating, worrying. And we get with stress, we go very inward. Usually when people are stressed, their physiology is shoulders rounded down and forward, the sternum bone sunken down, diaphragm constricted, so not breathing, head going slightly forward, so the brain is sort of forward of the heart. And it's because we are in a process of self-consuming energy. And what do you need for intimacy, sexual or otherwise? You need presence, and you need to be relaxed and to feel safe. And when you're dealing with stress, whether it's small stress or big stress, you're in somewhere on the spectrum of fight or flight, and you're so in your own world versus connecting with the other. So stress really is the thing that can drive people apart. And, and then you're not present. And then I think that this is a pretty much known thing, that if a man is stressed enough, can't even get an erection. So there's that.
Also, you mentioned the word relaxation. And I think that this is not enough talked about. The importance of how relaxation ties into all of this. Because when we do the healing work stressed out, intimacy flows naturally when we're relaxed.
Yes. So we have to feel safe. And we have to let go.
So what I'm hearing here is, for a couple who are so stressed out, it's almost like that stress doesn't leave room for intimacy and connection.
No, it doesn't. It becomes the wedge that pulls them apart. And so part of, if they were to be getting work on this, is to realize how they've been reacting to stressors, how that has been. This is why, once again, full circle, you can be with the right person for you. You could be with the quote unquote the one, but they can't, you're still going to experience that stress. That's you. That's you and your relationship with yourself and your relationship with what's going on in the world. And so I've seen relationships that should, in my opinion, not work because of not knowing how to kind of cope with stress.
So learning to cope with stress leads to deeper connection and intimacy in a relationship.
Yeah, what I would add to that is people think that their finances or their sex life or their relationship will all get better once they're less stressed. When really it's how we learn how to cope with that stress, how to wrestle with the stressors of our lives that will ultimately improve the relationship. And it will really, how we are able to deal with stress, the stressors in life, determines the quality of our personal lives. And I've been in states, emotional states, where my capacity to deal with small stressors was very, very low. And that's it sucks to be in that position. And it means you have to take a time out. It means you have to slow down. It means you have to connect with nature. It means you have to start exercising. It means you have to do certain things. It means you meditate, whatever it is, talk to someone to tone your nervous system, to be able to deal with the uncertainty that is woven into the very fabric of our daily lives.
One last question I have here for you is, where can people access your work? And are there any upcoming offerings that you would like to mention?
Oh, well, thank you so much. So yes, I believe this episode is coming out right when my book is out. So that's the most important thing. I wrote a book called It Begins With You, The 9 Hard Truths About Love That Will Change Your Life. And I basically put in the last 20 years of my working with people into this book and personal story and case studies. And you can order it at jillianturecki.com/book. You can order it from basically anywhere. So this is the main thing. Then, of course, there is my podcast, Jillian on Love, and where you can listen to it anywhere or watch it on YouTube. And then there is just my social media, Jillian Turecki, and I have a very special membership that I do for women. I do a lot of women's work, so it's called The Conscious Woman. And so that you can just find, you just need to know my name, and you can find me anywhere.
We're going to link all of this in the show notes and wherever the episode launches. Thank you, Jillian.
Thank you so much for having me.